At 2 a.m., my husband thought I was asleep, but I heard him whispering on the phone. Tomorrow she'll sign the will. In a month, the problem will solve itself. What he was discussing with our daughter, and when I learned their entire plan, made me in the morning. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that the worst thing that could happen to a woman my age was loneliness. I was wrong. The worst thing is betrayal, quiet, patient, and wearing the face of someone you love. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I am 74 years old. I live in the same White House in Asheville, North Carolina, where I raised my children, planted my roses, and buried my husband, Gerald, 6 years ago. After Gerald passed, the house felt too big and too silent. My daughter Renee suggested I wasn't safe living alone. My son-in-law Martin offered to help manage my finances. I thought they were being kind. I thought that was what family did. For 40 years, I taught high school English. I read Fitzgerald, Faulkner, O'Connor. I knew something about characters and their hidden motives. But somehow, when the story was my own, I became the most naive reader in the room. Life before that night in October was ordinary in the way that only a person looking back can truly appreciate. I gardened in the mornings. I had lunch on Tuesdays with my neighbor, Patsy Whitmore. I video called my grandchildren, Renee's kids, Lily and Connor, on Sunday evenings. I took my blood pressure medication at 7 a.m. and my calcium supplement at noon. I was careful, consistent, and content. The first warning signs I now understand had been there for months. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. It started with small things. Renee began calling more often. Not to chat, but to ask questions. About the house. About my retirement accounts. About what I planned to do with Gerald's life insurance. I told myself she was being responsible. She was nearly 50, practical by nature, always the organized one. When she suggested I see a financial planner, I nodded. When she said she could sit in on the meeting, I didn't object. I should have. Then Martin started appearing on weekday afternoons. Martin Greer was my son-in-law for 22 years. He sold commercial real estate, drove a new truck every 2 years, and had the kind of permanent smile that never quite reached his eyes. He began dropping by with excuses: a leaking gutter, a fence post that needed checking, a grocery run he was already doing anyway. Each visit ended with him walking through a different room of the house, looking at the walls, the ceilings, the floors, as if he were estimating something. One afternoon, I found him standing in Gerald's study, running his hand along the built-in bookshelves. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he said. "You know what this property is worth now, Dorothy? With the market the way it is?" I said I wasn't planning to sell. He smiled. "Of course not. Just saying." I replayed that conversation many times after. The week before everything changed, Renee brought me a stack of papers. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of my coffee and said she'd been talking to an estate attorney. "Just to get things in order, Mom, for everyone's peace of mind." The papers included a new will, a financial power of attorney, and a healthcare directive. Renee had already filled in most of the blanks. Her name appeared everywhere. Martin's name appeared in 2 places. "You don't have to sign today," she said. But she left the papers on the table. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle, the way it always does after 10 p.m., the old wood contracting in the cold air. Gerald used to say the house was just breathing. I heard Martin's voice before I heard the words. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I had gotten up for a glass of water and was passing the guest room. Renee and Martin were staying the week, something about renovations at their house, when I heard him through the door, speaking in a low, careful whisper. "She'll sign the will tomorrow. Renee's going to walk her through it in the morning while she's still groggy from the sleep medication." A pause. The doctor already said her heart is getting worse. A month, maybe 2, and the whole thing resolves itself. We won't have to do anything. I stood in the hallway in my nightgown, bare feet on the cold floor, holding a glass I had forgotten I was carrying. Won't have to do anything. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. The glass in my hand was shaking slightly. I steadied it, pressed my back against the wall, and breathed through my nose the way I had taught myself to breathe during the hardest years. The years of Gerald's illness, the years of budget cuts and difficult students, and a world that didn't always make sense. Then I walked back to my bedroom, set the glass on the nightstand, and lay down. I did not sleep, but I did not cry either. I simply began to think. By 4 in the morning, I had gone over every conversation from the past 8 months and found the pattern I had been too trusting to see while it was forming. The financial planner meeting, where Renee had done most of the talking. The afternoon Martin had photographed the house for insurance purposes. The appointment Renee had scheduled with my cardiologist without telling me until the day before, where she sat beside me and asked the doctor, in her careful, reasonable voice, whether my condition was likely to progress significantly in the coming year. The doctor had spoken gently about the reality of aging hearts. Renee had nodded and taken notes. She had been building a case, not against an enemy, against her own mother. I lay there in the dark and felt fear move through me like cold water. Not the sharp, sudden fear of a loud noise, but the slow, spreading kind. The fear of understanding something that cannot be ununderstood. My daughter, whom I had nursed through chickenpox and a broken engagement and a miscarriage she never told her husband about, had decided that I was a problem to be managed. That my life, my home, my savings, everything Gerald and I had built across 5 decades, were assets to be transferred on a timeline she and Martin had already calculated. Won't have to do anything. Martin's words. And what had he meant? That my heart would simply give out? That they were counting on it? I thought about the sleep medication Renee had mentioned. I thought about how she had started bringing it to me each night herself, pressed into my palm with a glass of water and a goodnight kiss. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? I got up at 5:30. I did not take the pill she had left on my nightstand. I put on my robe and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with Gerald's old legal pad and a pen. I was a woman who made lists. I had always made lists. It was how I processed the world, one line at a time until the shape of a problem became visible. What did I know for certain? Martin was on a phone call at 2 a.m., discussing my will and my death with someone. Renee had prepared legal documents naming herself as my primary beneficiary and power of attorney. I had been given sleep medication each night by my daughter without a clear explanation of the prescription. My cardiologist had been consulted about the timeline of my decline. What did I not yet know? Who Martin had been speaking to? Whether the documents Renee brought were legally valid as drafted, whether the medication was what she said it was, whether anyone else was involved. What could I do? I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote the first word. Attorney. Not Renee's estate attorney. My own. Someone she didn't know from a firm she had never heard of. I had met a woman at Patsy's book club 2 years ago, Frances Odom, a recently retired family law attorney who had moved to Asheville after 30 years in Charlotte. She had given me her card because we'd had a long conversation about Willa Cather. I still had the card and Gerald's old Rolodex on the desk in the study. The second word I wrote was doctor. I needed to speak to my cardiologist alone, without Renee in the room, and I needed to ask specific questions about what she had been told and what information she had been given by my family. The third word, medication. I needed to know what I had been taking. The pill bottle in the bathroom said Ambien and had my name on it, but it had appeared 2 weeks ago without a pharmacy receipt, and I had never been prescribed a sleep medication by my own doctor. The fourth word I wrote was the hardest: evidence, because none of what I knew meant anything without proof. I could not walk into an attorney's office and say my daughter had whispered something in the night. I could not accuse Martin of planning to wait for my death without something more than a conversation I had overheard through a closed door. I needed documentation, recorded conversations, a paper trail, something a court would take seriously. I was a 74-year-old retired English teacher, not a private investigator. But I had spent 40 years teaching students to read carefully, think critically, and find evidence for every claim. I knew how to build a case. When I heard Renee's footsteps in the upstairs hallway at 7:15, I folded the legal pad and slid it inside the cover of the large Oxford English Dictionary on the kitchen shelf. Then I put the kettle on, turned to face the window, and waited. She came downstairs in her bathrobe, her hair pulled back, carrying her phone. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Morning, Mom. How'd you sleep?" "Wonderfully," I said. I handed her a cup of coffee and smiled. And I watched her face, the way I had once watched students who thought they'd gotten away with something, looking for the small, involuntary flicker of relief. There it was. She thought I was still her manageable, agreeable, sleeping mother. She had no idea I had been awake for 5 hours, thinking clearly for the first time in months. That afternoon, while Renee took a nap and Martin drove to Home Depot, for reasons I no longer bothered to believe, I walked 3 blocks to Patsy's house and borrowed her phone. I called Frances Odom at 2:17 p.m. She answered on the third ring. I told her I needed to speak with her privately and urgently. She asked if I could come to her home office the following morning. "Yes," I said. "But please don't contact me at my home number or on my personal cell. I'll explain when I see you." There was a brief pause. Frances was a smart woman. "I understand," she said. 9 o'clock. I walked back home through the autumn leaves, the bright orange and red of the Asheville Hills all around me, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. It was clarity, and beneath it, something older and harder. Resolve. Frances Odom's home office was in the back of a neat craftsman bungalow on Kimberly Avenue, behind a garden that was still holding its late autumn color. She was a trim woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of deliberate stillness that comes from spending decades in courtrooms. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a moment. "Dorothy," she said, "what you're describing has a name. It's called undue influence, and in cases where financial documents are prepared by a family member who stands to benefit, combined with evidence of isolation and medication management, it rises to the level of elder financial abuse under North Carolina law." I had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud in a lawyer's voice in the cool morning light made it real in a different way. Frances told me what I needed to do, in what order. First, I needed to establish legal representation immediately and ensure that any documents I had been presented with were reviewed before I signed anything. Second, I needed to speak to my own physician, not my cardiologist, but my primary care doctor, separately and privately, and request a formal cognitive evaluation to create an official record that I was of sound mind and had not requested any sedative medication. Third, I needed to document everything I could remember with dates, times, and specific language. And fourth, I needed to be patient. "The goal," Frances said, "is not to confront. Not yet. The goal is to build a foundation so solid that when you do act, nothing they say can touch it." I walked out of that office with a signed representation agreement in my purse and a list of next steps written in Frances's clear, even handwriting. The morning felt different. Asheville in November has a particular quality of light, low and golden, coming through the bare branches at a long angle. I drove myself home and went inside and acted exactly as I always had. What I didn't know was that Renee had already noticed something. That evening, she mentioned casually that she'd seen Mrs. Whitmore while getting the mail. "She said she saw you walking to her house yesterday?" Renee's tone was light, but her eyes were watchful. "I didn't know you two had plans." "We don't always need plans," I said. "She's my neighbor." "Of course." A pause. "You could have just used your cell, though, Mom, if you needed to make a call." I looked at her directly. "I know that, sweetheart." She smiled and changed the subject, but I saw her send a text message when she thought I wasn't looking. 2 days later, I saw my primary care physician, Dr. Anita Reeves, at a routine appointment I had already had scheduled. I had called ahead and asked the receptionist to note that this visit was to be private. No family members in the examination room, and no information released to anyone without my written authorization. I also asked Dr. Reeves to run a complete blood panel. The results came back 4 days later. My blood showed trace amounts of a benzodiazepine compound, specifically a low dose of lorazepam. I had not been prescribed lorazepam. I had not, to my knowledge, ever taken it. I sat with that information for a full 24 hours before I called Frances. "That's your proof," Frances said. Her voice was very calm. "That's the point of no return." The medication Renee had been pressing into my palm each night, the pill she told me was Ambien for sleep, contained a compound that was not what she said it was. Lorazepam at low doses would not simply help me sleep. It would keep me compliant, slow, slightly confused, easy to manage, easy to guide toward a signature. Frances asked me to bring the pill bottle to her office. I brought it the following morning. She photographed it, documented the label, and sent it to a pharmacist she trusted for independent analysis. She also contacted an elder law specialist colleague at a firm in Charlotte who had handled similar cases. The case now had a second professional supporting it. It had medical evidence, it had legal representation, and it had, for the first time, the shape of something that could win. That same afternoon, Martin knocked on the study door where I was reading and sat down across from me with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was still in control of the situation. He asked if I had thought any more about the documents Renee had left. "I'm still looking them over," I said. "There's no rush," he said. "But the attorney did say that having things formalized sooner rather than later gives you more control, not less. It protects you, Dorothy." He said it warmly, generously, as though he were doing me a favor. I nodded and thanked him. I watched him leave the room, and I thought, "You have no idea that the pharmacist's report will be ready by Friday. You have no idea that Frances Odom is already on the phone with the Charlotte firm. You have no idea that this house, this chair, this quiet room is no longer your plan. It is mine." I turned back to my book. My hands were steady. By the second week of November, the plan had 4 concrete elements. Frances had advised patience, but she had also said that the window to act was not indefinite. Renee and Martin would keep pressing for the signature, and the longer I delayed without explanation, the more likely they were to grow suspicious or take some form of preemptive action. The first element was a new, independent will. I drafted it with Frances over 2 sessions. Everything was simple and intentional. The house would go into a living trust I controlled. A portion of Gerald's life insurance and my retirement savings would be placed in a structured charitable remainder trust managed by the community foundation I had supported for years. Specific bequests would go to Patsy, to my former teaching colleague Ruth Ann Hartley, and to Lily and Connor's college funds. not through their parents, but directly with a trustee appointed by the court. Renee would receive a modest inheritance, as was fair. But she would not receive the house. She would not receive the accounts. She would not receive power of attorney. The second element was a formal police report. Francis had advised this carefully. Given the medication evidence, we had grounds to file a report with the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office documenting suspected elder abuse. This was not something I did lightly. Renee was my daughter. I had loved her for 50 years. But the report was not an accusation in the public sense. Not yet. It was documentation. A timestamp. Proof that I had raised the issue while I was still in full possession of my faculties, before any signature had been obtained. I filed the report on a Thursday morning, in person, with Francis present. The third element was my cardiologist. I requested a separate, private appointment and asked for a complete review of any communications she had received from Renee or from Martin about my condition. What I learned was careful but significant. Renee had called the office on 2 occasions, asking about the likely progression of my heart disease. She had described herself as my primary caregiver and had asked whether cognitive changes were common in patients with my diagnosis. My cardiologist, who had known me for 11 years, had found the calls unusual, but had not known they were unauthorized. She documented them now at my request and signed a letter confirming my cognitive clarity. The fourth element was the pharmacist's report. It had come back confirming the presence of lorazepam in the pills I had provided. Francis photographed every page. It was on a Friday afternoon, the 15th of November, that everything accelerated. Renee knocked on my bedroom door while I was at my writing desk and asked if we could talk. Her voice had a new quality, careful and slightly taut, like a wire under strain. I said yes. She sat on the edge of the bed. Martin stood in the doorway. "Mom," Renee said, "we know you went to see a lawyer." I didn't ask how. I simply waited. "We're not angry," she said. "We understand you might have concerns. But what you need to understand is that this was all done to protect you. Martin and I have been worried sick about you living here alone, about your health, about what happens if—" She stopped. "We're your family. We love you. This was never about anything other than making sure you're taken care of." Martin spoke from the doorway. His voice was quieter, and there was something beneath the warmth now that I recognized. A harder register. "Dorothy, you have to understand the position this puts us in. Lily and Connor need stability. Renee has sacrificed a lot to be here for you. If you bring attorneys and legal complications into this, if you make accusations, it could hurt people who love you. It could damage the whole family." I looked at him. "Are you threatening me, Martin?" "Of course not." The smile again. "I'm telling you what's at stake." "What's at stake?" I said. "Is my home, my money, and my independence. I understand exactly what's at stake." Renee's composure cracked slightly. "Mom, you don't understand. The attorney we found, the will we prepared, everything was designed to make sure you're secure. If you fight this, if you bring in outside people, you'll only create chaos and legal fees and heartbreak." "The medication in my nightstand was not Ambien," I said. The room went silent. I watched Renee's face. I watched Martin's hand tighten on the doorframe. "It contained lorazepam," I said. "I had it tested." Renee stood up. Her voice when she spoke was unsteady. "Mom, I was just trying to help you sleep." "I think we're done for tonight," I said. They left. I heard them in the hallway, low, urgent voices. I sat at my writing desk and did not move until their door closed. Then I allowed myself to feel it, all of it, for exactly 10 minutes. The grief of it, the profound, exhausting grief of what my daughter had become, or perhaps what she had always been. And I had loved her too much to see. After 10 minutes, I picked up the phone and called Frances. Then I called my cousin Margaret in Brevard and asked if I could stay with her for a week. I needed to breathe. I needed distance. I needed to come back strong. Margaret's house in Brevard was small and cheerful, full of plants and quilts and the smell of wood smoke. She was 71 and had outlasted 2 bad marriages and a bout of breast cancer with the kind of good-natured ferocity that I had always admired. I had told her the essential facts on the phone. She had not asked unnecessary questions. She had simply said, "Come." I stayed for 6 days. On the 3rd day, Renee called my cell phone 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. The messages began as concerned, "Mom, we're worried, please call," and shifted, by the 4th message, into something more deliberate. Renee's voice was measured, rehearsed. She said she had spoken to a doctor she knew who specialized in elder cognition. She said that my behavior, the sudden secrecy, the refusal to communicate, the suspicious thinking, might indicate that my heart condition was affecting my judgment. She said she was only mentioning this out of love and because she didn't want me to make decisions I would regret. She was preparing a narrative. A woman acting strangely, disconnected from her family, perhaps not entirely of sound mind. It was a preemptive move. If I accused them, she wanted a counterstory ready. I had expected it. Frances had warned me that this was a common tactic in elder financial abuse cases. I forwarded the voicemail recordings to Frances that evening. Martin sent a text message the following day. It was brief and in its way almost elegant in its manipulation. "Dorothy, I know things are tense. I want you to know that whatever happens, I've always respected you. You built something remarkable with Gerald. We don't want to be on opposite sides. Let's talk. Just the 2 of us without lawyers. I think we can find a way through this that doesn't hurt anyone." I read it once. I did not reply. Cold calm was not something I had possessed naturally in my youth. I had been, for most of my life, a warm and reactive woman. Quick to laugh, quick to cry, quick to engage. But grief does something to a person. Gerald's illness had done it to me. Watching him diminish day by day over 14 months, staying present, staying steady, continuing to make the right decisions even when everything in me wanted to collapse, had changed the architecture of my composure. I knew how to wait. I knew how to hold. I spent those 6 days in Brevard doing ordinary things. I walked the French Broad River Trail in the mornings. I helped Margaret put up her storm windows. I cooked a pot of chicken and dumplings that lasted 3 days. I read. I slept without medication and woke up feeling, for the first time in months, like myself. Frances called on Wednesday with an update. The pharmacist's written report had been received. The sheriff's department had assigned a detective named Howell to the case. Frances had made contact with a senior investigator at North Carolina's Adult Protective Services. "The structure is solid now," she said. "We're ready to move when you are." I also called Ruth Ann Hartley, my old colleague from the high school, who had become a fierce advocate for senior citizens after her own mother was victimized by a financial scammer 10 years earlier. Ruth Ann drove up from Hendersonville, and we sat at Margaret's kitchen table for 3 hours. She brought me into contact with a support network she had helped organize. A group of women in western North Carolina, many of them widows, who had experienced similar attempts by family members or caregivers. They met informally, twice a month. Several had taken legal action. Several had won. I joined the group. On my last evening in Brevard, Margaret and I sat on her porch with cups of tea as the mountains went dark and the first stars appeared. She said, You know, the hardest part isn't the legal fight. No, I said. The hardest part is not hating her. Margaret looked at the stars. You can love someone completely and still refuse to let them destroy you. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, I drove back to Asheville. I parked in my own driveway, unlocked my own front door, walked into my own house. The papers Renee had left on the kitchen table were still there. I picked them up, carried them to my study, and placed them in the folder Frances had labeled Exhibit A. I made coffee. I watered my plants. I sat in Gerald's chair by the window and watched the street. They would come again, I was sure of that. I was ready. They came on a Saturday, 2 weeks after I returned from Brevard. Renee arrived first, alone, at 10 in the morning. She knocked instead of using her key. That was new. She was dressed quietly, no jewelry, no makeup to speak of. She was carrying a tin of the lemon shortbread she knew I loved, the kind she only baked when she wanted something. I let her in. I put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table. She began by apologizing. She was very good at it. The apology was layered. Sorrow for making me feel pressured. Acknowledgement that the documents had come too quickly. Regret that I had felt managed. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her eyes were wet. Mom, I'm scared. That's all this ever was. I'm scared of losing you like we lost Dad, and I overstepped, and I'm so sorry. I listened. I kept my face soft. I knew every word was a performance, but I also understood that beneath the performance there was perhaps a thread of something real. A daughter who did, in some partial and distorted way, love her mother. That was the most painful part. It was not purely monstrous. It was human, and it had still come within days of destroying me. I looked around my kitchen, the windowsill with Gerald's old coffee mug I still kept there, the calendar with my handwriting marking Tuesday lunches, the hook by the door where my garden gloves hung. Everything ordinary, everything mine. And across the table, my daughter, performing grief over a mother she had already begun to bury in her plans. I forgive you, I said, because I meant it, though not in the way she intended me to mean it. Relief moved across her face. She squeezed my hand. Then she said, I'd love it if we could just sit down with the new attorney, someone neutral, someone you've never met, and go over everything together. Not my draft, a fresh one. Clean slate, just to make sure you're protected. That's all I'm asking. There it was. The neutral attorney. The clean slate. The process she could control by being in the room. I have my own attorney now, I said pleasantly. Frances Odom. She's handling everything. Renee withdrew her hand slowly. Mom, Frances is someone you found through a neighbor. You don't know her background, her experience with estates. She was a family law attorney in Charlotte for 30 years, I said. I'm very comfortable with her. A pause. Martin would like to see you. He's welcome to come inside. Martin came in from wherever he had been waiting. The car, I assumed. He was dressed in his good jacket. He sat down and, for a moment, looked almost genuinely uncomfortable. Then the performance settled over him again. Dorothy, he said, I want to say something man to man, woman to man. He paused at the phrase, acknowledged the awkwardness with a small smile. You've hired an attorney. You've been talking to people about things that are private family matters. I understand you're upset, but what you may not fully understand is the legal exposure you're creating for yourself. I beg your pardon, I said, making accusations of elder abuse. He said it calmly as though explaining a technical term, against family members, without evidence that can actually hold up. Those kinds of claims can be very damaging to everyone, including the person making them. Courts don't look kindly on elderly individuals who make claims they can't substantiate. It puts your own judgment into question. He held my gaze. It was meant to frighten me. It was, I had to admit, somewhat effective. A cold, prickling fear moved through me. Not of him exactly, but of the machinery he was invoking. Legal systems. Courts. The humiliation of being portrayed as a confused old woman who had accused her family out of paranoia. I thought of my students, the ones who had faced a difficult passage in a novel and wanted to skip ahead to find the easier version of the story. I had always told them, stay in the hard part. The hard part is where you learn what the author actually meant. I appreciate your concern, I said. We're not your enemies, Dorothy. We're trying to protect you. From what? I asked. He blinked. You keep saying you're protecting me, I said. Protecting me from what, exactly? From my own attorney? From my own doctor? From deciding for myself what happens to my house? He recalibrated. From making decisions under stress that you might regret. Martin, I said, I'm a 74-year-old retired teacher who has been running my own life for over half a century. I believe I'm capable of deciding what I might regret. He looked at Renee. Something passed between them. A quick, involuntary exchange, the kind that happens between people who have rehearsed a scene and suddenly found themselves off script. Renee looked down at her hands. Martin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll give you more time, Renee said at last. Her voice had gone flat, the performance stripped away entirely now. But Mom, I want you to know that if this becomes adversarial, if lawyers start sending letters and investigators start asking questions, it will tear this family apart. And that's on you, not us. You. She stood. Martin stood. Neither of them touched me on the way out. The tin of lemon shortbread sat unopened on the table. I noticed as Martin passed the kitchen doorway that his eyes moved once, quickly, automatically, across the room, the way they always did. Cataloging. Estimating. Even now, even in retreat. They left. I heard the car pull out of the driveway. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The fear was still there, cold and real. The fear of consequences, of damage, of a public fight with my own daughter. I felt its full weight, and I did not try to push it away. I had learned that fear ignored has a way of returning larger. And then I thought of Martin's hand on the doorframe, the night I told them about the lorazepam. I thought of the voicemail, the neutral attorney, the implication that I was too old to be trusted with my own affairs. I thought of the tin of shortbread and what it had been meant to accomplish. The fear didn't disappear, but it hardened into something useful. I called Frances on Monday morning and told her we were ready to move. Frances had spent 3 weeks quietly and methodically building what she called a complete structural case. By the time we were ready to act, there was a pharmacist's written analysis, a medical record from Dr. Reeves documenting the unauthorized benzodiazepine, a sworn statement from my cardiologist describing Renee's unauthorized inquiries, a police report filed with the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, a completed referral to Adult Protective Services, and a recorded voicemail in which Renee had obliquely referenced my cognition as a preemptive narrative device. Frances had also obtained phone records showing that Martin had made multiple calls to a second attorney, not the estate attorney, in the weeks leading up to the night I overheard him. The decisive meeting was held in Frances's office on a Tuesday morning in December, 12 days before Christmas. Frances had requested that Renee and Martin attend, and she had phrased it neutrally enough, a mediated discussion to avoid prolonged legal proceedings, that they had agreed. They arrived together, Martin in his good jacket again, Renee with her hair done carefully. They sat across the conference table from Frances and me. Their attorney, whose name was Terence Bale, sat beside Martin. I had not known they would bring Bale, but Francis had prepared for it. I had been in that office twice before, for document signings, but that morning it felt different. The long oak table, the winter light coming flat and white through the blinds, the particular silence of a room in which something consequential is about to happen. I had felt that silence before, in hospital waiting rooms, in Gerald's last weeks. I knew how to sit inside it. Francis began by placing a single sheet of paper on the table. It was the pharmacist's analysis. She did not explain it. She let Bale and Martin read it in silence. Bale said, "This analysis is based on a pill taken from Mrs. Callahan's home. There's no established chain of custody. The pill bottle bears the label Dorothy Callahan, dated October 14th, dispensed by a pharmacy in Biltmore Village," Francis said. "The pharmacy has no record of that prescription. The prescribing physician listed on the label does not have Dorothy as a patient." She placed a second document on the table, the pharmacy's written statement confirming no record of the prescription. Renee's face had gone very still. "We also have the records from 2 phone calls placed to Dr. Kathleen Murray's office," Francis continued, "in which the caller, who identified herself as Dorothy's primary caregiver and daughter, inquired specifically about the timeline of cognitive decline associated with Dorothy's cardiac diagnosis. Dr. Murray has documented both calls and confirmed she did not have Dorothy's authorization to discuss her case with any third party." Francis placed those records on the table. Martin said, "This is a mischaracterization of entirely normal family concern. The police report filed November 8th documents suspected elder financial abuse," Francis said, without raising her voice. She placed the report on the table. "The Adult Protective Services referral was opened November 9th. A PS conducted its own preliminary investigation and found sufficient grounds to proceed. Their investigator is available to speak with your client's attorney today, Mr. Bale, if he wishes." Bale leaned over and said something quietly to Martin. Martin's jaw was tight. Renee looked at me across the table. For a moment, she looked simply like my daughter, frightened and young in a way she hadn't been for 30 years. The careful hair, the composed expression, all of it had slipped. Beneath it was something rawer, something I recognized from a very long time ago. The face she used to make as a child when she had been caught in a lie and knew that I knew. I had always found it easier then to forgive her. That was the trap I had spent 50 years inside. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke slightly. "Mom, I know what you did," I said. I kept my voice even. "I know what the medication was. I know what Martin said on the phone the night of October 7th. I know what the documents were designed to accomplish. I am not confused, Renee. I was never confused." Martin said, "We can resolve this privately. There is no need for APS, no need for any of this to go further. If Dorothy is feeling pressured, we can simply withdraw the documents, and—" "The documents were withdrawn 3 weeks ago," Francis said. "Dorothy signed a new independent will and living trust on November 22nd, witnessed by 2 independent parties and filed with the county. Additionally, a report of the medication incident has been forwarded to the North Carolina Medical Board, as the prescription label names a physician who may have been complicit. And as of this morning, we have filed a formal complaint with the state bar regarding the estate attorney who drafted the original documents. Given the clear evidence that the documents were designed to benefit the drafting party's clients at the expense of an elderly client they did not represent." Bale said nothing. He was, I noticed, writing quickly. His pen had not stopped moving since Francis placed the third document on the table. Whatever he had been told to expect when he walked into this room, it had not been this. Martin turned to me. The warmth was entirely gone. His face, without the performance, was something I had never quite seen before. Not angry, exactly, but stripped, exposed. The face of a man who had believed he was smarter than the situation and had just discovered he was not. His voice was quiet and flat. "You have no idea what you've started, Dorothy." "I have a complete idea," I said. "That's the difference between us." Renee put her face in her hands. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Bale requested a recess to consult with his client. Frances granted it. In the hallway, while we waited, she put her hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "You did very well." I nodded. I was thinking about Gerald and about how he would have smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Gerald had never been a man who enjoyed winning over people. But the particular smile he reserved for moments when something difficult had been done with integrity, the smile that said, "This is how it was supposed to go." The months that followed were not without their difficulties. Legal processes are slow and imperfect, and justice, when it comes, rarely arrives the way it does in the stories we were told as children. Suddenly, dramatically, with clear sides and unambiguous outcomes. But it came. The Adult Protective Services investigation concluded in January with a formal finding of financial exploitation and medication misuse. The finding was entered into the state registry. It would follow Renee and Martin in any future proceedings involving vulnerable adults. The criminal matter moved more slowly. The Buncombe County Sheriff assigned Detective Howell to the case in November, and by February he had assembled enough evidence, including the pharmacy records, the medical documentation, and phone records obtained through a warrant, to refer the case to the district attorney's office for consideration of charges. In March, the DA filed charges against Martin Greer for elder financial exploitation under North Carolina General Statute 14-112.2. The charge was a Class F felony. Renee was not charged criminally. There was insufficient direct evidence that she had knowingly provided a controlled substance with intent to harm. The medication case was circumstantial enough that the DA declined to prosecute it as a criminal matter. But she was named as a respondent in the APS civil finding, and Frances filed a civil suit on my behalf seeking damages for financial manipulation, emotional distress, and costs associated with the legal proceedings. In April, Martin's attorney reached out to Frances to discuss a settlement. Martin did not want a trial. A trial meant testimony, and testimony meant the recorded phone conversations, the pharmacy records, the cardiologist's documentation, all of it read aloud in a courtroom where journalists and neighbors and anyone else who cared to attend could hear it. I thought of all the Saturday afternoons Martin had stood in my driveway, talking to neighbors about their property values, the easy authority in his voice, the way people deferred to him. A courtroom would cost him that. The settlement offer was, in its way, an admission of how much that cost him. Frances presented me with the settlement offer and explained my options. I took 24 hours to think about it. "I want accountability," I told Frances, "not money." "Then we don't settle," she said. We didn't settle. The trial was held in June. It was 4 days. I testified for 2 hours on the second day. I wore Gerald's pearls and the gray wool suit I had worn to the most important meetings of my life, and I answered every question in a clear voice. The prosecutor was a young woman named Diaz, who had a precise, unhurried manner I found reassuring. She asked me to describe, in my own words, the night of October 7th. I described it. I described the hallway, the cold floor under my bare feet, the glass of water in my hand, Martin's voice through the door. I described what I felt. I described what I decided. I did not cry. I had decided some weeks earlier that I would not give them my tears. Not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper, not in any record that would outlast the moment. I had spent enough of my emotional life in service of other people's comfort. These 2 hours belonged to the truth. Martin's attorney attempted, on cross-examination, to suggest that my hearing was unreliable, that the hallway conversation could have been misinterpreted, that a woman with a cardiac condition taking nighttime medication might confuse the details of a half-heard exchange. I listened to each question carefully and answered it exactly. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. I did not become defensive. I remained, as Francis had coached me, and as I had practiced in the mirror for 3 mornings running, simply clear. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on the primary charge and on a second charge of financial fraud related to the preparation of unauthorized documents. Martin was sentenced to 14 months in a minimum security facility and 3 years of probation. He was ordered to pay restitution. He would carry a criminal record for the rest of his life. I watched him receive the sentence from across the courtroom. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor, then at his attorney, then at some middle distance that contained, I supposed, the future he had planned, and the future he now had instead. The restitution figure was smaller than what Francis had sought. I had expected that. Courts measure financial harm in ways that don't fully account for the cost of fear, of lost sleep, of sitting at a kitchen table at 5 in the morning, trying to understand why your daughter had chosen this. But it was something. It was his name in a public record, permanent and unambiguous. Renee and I faced each other briefly in the courthouse hallway after the verdict. She looked diminished, thinner, older, her face held together by something that was not quite composure. She said, "I hope you're satisfied." I thought about what I wanted to say. There were many things. I thought about the lemon shortbread on the kitchen table. I thought about the goodnight kiss and the pill pressed into my palm. I thought about the voice through the door and the cold floor and the glass that shook. "I hope," I said, "that someday you'll understand what you almost took from me." She turned and walked away. I watched her go until she pushed through the courthouse doors and the December light swallowed her. Francis took me to lunch afterward at a restaurant on Lexington Avenue with big windows and late afternoon light. We had a glass of wine. She told me it was one of the most thoroughly documented elder abuse cases she had seen in her career. I thanked her. She thanked me for my patience, for my precision, for the legal pad covered in lists. Driving home, I passed the street where I had taught for so many years. The school was still there, brick and familiar. I thought of all the students I had watched read their first difficult texts, the ones who wanted the story to be simpler than it was, and the ones who stayed with the complexity until it opened. I had stayed with the complexity. I turned onto my street. The White House was there, in the December light, exactly as it had always been. The rose bushes needed cutting back. The porch needed a new coat of paint. It was mine. The year that followed the trial was the best year I had lived since Gerald was healthy. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, that the aftermath of betrayal in legal proceedings could somehow open into something good. But I had learned something during those months that I hadn't known I needed to learn, what I was capable of, and what my life actually contained. In the fall, I enrolled in a watercolor class at the Arts Center on Merriman Avenue. Gerald had always encouraged me to try painting, and I had always found an excuse not to. I was not particularly talented, but I enjoyed it with a wholeness that surprised me. I painted the mountains in October, the rose garden in May, and Gerald's reading chair in the afternoon light 3 times until I got the shadow right. Patsy and I established a proper Tuesday lunch that we rarely missed. We added Ruth Ann Hartley on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. The 3 of us ate well and talked about books and local politics, and the small indignities and unexpected pleasures of being women of a certain age in a world that persistently underestimated us. The support group Ruth Ann had introduced me to became something I gave back to as much as I took from it. By spring, I was helping newer members navigate the early stages of what they were facing. The fear, the grief of discovering that someone you loved had been calculating behind your kind eyes. I kept the house. I planted climbing roses along the back fence, deep pink, a variety Gerald had mentioned once and never gotten around to. I had the porch repainted white and bought a new armchair in forest green for the study. Lily and Connor's college funds received their bequests on schedule. I wrote them each a letter explaining in age-appropriate terms that I loved them. Lily, 16 and already paying close attention to the world, wrote me back a letter that made me press my hand over my heart for a long moment. Renee and Martin's life came apart in the year following the verdict with the quiet thoroughness of a structure whose foundations had always been weaker than they appeared. Martin served 9 months before early release. The criminal record cost him his commercial real estate license. He appealed. The appeal failed. He found work eventually in property management. I didn't see him again. Renee moved to Charlotte. I heard through Patsy that she had struggled with Martin's legal situation, the financial stress, with whatever version of herself she had to live with now that everything had failed so completely. I had decided not to wonder about her remorse. It was not cruelty. It was self-preservation. I had given 50 years of love to my daughter, and she had nearly used it to destroy me. There was a boundary I needed to maintain, not out of hatred, but out of respect for my own survival. I used part of the civil settlement to establish a scholarship at my former high school, the Gerald and Dorothy Callahan Award for Critical Thinking. The first recipient was a girl named Maya, who was exceptionally good at reading difficult texts and finding the truth in them. I attended the ceremony in the spring, watching Maya accept her certificate with a composure that seemed slightly too old for her 17 years. She reminded me of myself. On the drive home, I stopped at the overlook above the city, window down in the warm May air, looking at the mountains, green now, fully in leaf, enormous and unhurried. 74 years old, I thought. Still here, still mine. The night I stood in that dark hallway and heard my husband's voice say, "The problem will resolve itself." I could have gone back to bed and pretended I hadn't heard. Many people do. Fear is powerful, and love makes us want to believe the best. But I had been taught, by books, by decades, by loss, that truth, once known, cannot safely be ignored. If someone you trust is quietly preparing to take everything from you, do not wait for them to finish. What would you have done in my place? If this story reached you somewhere real, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you believe someone else needs to hear it, please share it. Thank you for listening. One day, my son accidentally left his phone at my house. When a message from his wife came in, I picked up the phone and read it. What they were planning made me immediately call my lawyer with a revenge plan. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway, and I was 68 years old when my life changed in a single afternoon, because of a forgotten phone and a message I was never supposed to read. Let me start from the beginning, because stories like mine don't begin with the dramatic moment. They begin quietly, in kitchens that smell like biscuits and coffee, in houses full of photographs, in years of ordinary love that you assume will always be returned. I had lived in the same house in Franklin, Tennessee for 31 years. My late husband, Robert, built the back porch with his own hands. We raised 2 children there, Daniel, our son, and Claire, our daughter. When Robert passed from a heart attack 6 years ago, I thought the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. I was wrong. Daniel was 42. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a silver Lexus, and had married Brittany 8 years before. A woman 10 years his junior with sharp cheekbones, sharper opinions, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I had tried in the beginning. Lord knows I tried. I brought casseroles to their house in Brentwood. I offered to babysit their 2 boys, Tyler and Mason. I bit my tongue at Christmas dinners when Brittany made comments about my cooking, my house, my way of doing things. But something had shifted in the last 2 years. The invitations to family dinners became rarer. Daniel's phone calls grew shorter, more formal, like he was speaking to a business acquaintance rather than his mother. When I asked if something was wrong, he always said the same thing. "Everything's fine, Mom. We're just busy." I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was Brittany's influence. Her family had never been close, and she had always seemed vaguely uncomfortable with how much Robert and I had given to our children. But I pushed the worry down. I watered my garden. I went to church on Sundays. I had lunch with my friend Dorothy every Tuesday at the Blue Moon Diner on Main Street. Then came the Thursday in April that changed everything. Daniel had stopped by that morning, briefly, unexpectedly, to drop off some papers related to my car insurance, which he had always helped me manage. He seemed distracted, checked his watch twice, and left within 20 minutes. I noticed his phone on the kitchen counter only after I heard his car pull out of the driveway. I picked it up to call him. I truly did. But before I could dial, the screen lit up in my hand with a message from Brittany. I still remember exactly what it said. I have replayed it in my mind hundreds of times since. "Did she sign anything yet? We need to move on the account before the end of the month. If she won't cooperate, we'll go the other route. The attorney in Nashville said it's doable if we establish diminished capacity. She's old enough that nobody will question it." I stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had made Daniel's birthday cakes for 42 years. And I read those words 3 times. Diminished capacity. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, to take control of my finances, to take the house, to take everything Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. My hands did not shake. I noticed that later, that my hands were completely still. But something inside me went very cold and very quiet, the way the air goes still just before a bad storm rolls in over the Tennessee hills. I set the phone back on the counter exactly where I had found it. I walked to the living room and sat in Robert's old armchair by the window. I looked out at the dogwood tree in the front yard, the one he had planted the year Daniel was born. And I thought, so this is what it's come to. Daniel came back for the phone 20 minutes later. He was apologetic, flustered. I handed it to him with a smile and said I hadn't noticed it until he knocked. He gave me a quick hug and left. I watched the silver Lexus disappear down the street. Then I went to my desk, opened my address book, and found the number for Howard Finch, the best estate attorney in Williamson County, and a man my husband had trusted for 20 years. I did not cry, not then. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I had work to do. I sat at that desk for a long time before I picked up the phone. The house was quiet around me. The particular quiet of a home that has known a family and now holds its memories like pressed flowers between pages. Robert's reading glasses were still on the shelf by the fireplace. I hadn't been able to move them. Now, looking at them, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief, but anger. A slow, clarifying anger that rose through me like heat. Who did they think I was? I was a woman who had nursed a dying husband through 18 months of heart disease without once falling apart in front of the children. A woman who had managed every bill, every tax return, every investment account since Robert's death. Not because I had to, but because I had always been the quiet competence behind this family. Robert had been the warmth. I had been the foundation. And now my own son and his wife thought they could whisper behind my back about diminished capacity? I pulled out a legal pad and a pen, and I began to write. First, I listed what I owned. The house in Franklin, paid off, worth somewhere between $580,000 and $640,000, according to recent neighborhood sales. The investment account Robert and I had built over decades, currently holding just over $410,000, a smaller savings account, a modest IRA, a life insurance policy with Daniel listed as the primary beneficiary, something I had set up years ago without a second thought. Then I listed what I stood to lose. If they succeeded, if a judge somewhere actually agreed that I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own affairs, a conservator would be appointed. In cases like that, family members often petition to serve as conservators themselves. Daniel would control my money. Brittany would be standing right behind him. I had seen enough news stories to know how these situations ended for elderly women living alone. The thought made me set down my pen and press my palms flat on the desk. Was I afraid? Yes. I will not pretend otherwise. Fear is not weakness. It is information. And the information my fear was giving me was simple. You are in danger, and no one is coming to help you unless you go find them. I thought about calling Claire. My daughter lived in Portland, Oregon, 3 time zones away, managing a landscape architecture firm and raising 2 girls with her husband, Pete. Claire and Daniel had never been particularly close, and Claire had said things about Brittany over the years that I had politely deflected. Claire would be furious. She would fly in. She would make noise. And noise, I decided, was not what I needed yet. Not yet. What I needed was strategy. I picked up the phone and called Howard Finch. Howard was 71, semi-retired, and had drawn up Robert's will 15 years ago. He was a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness and remained undisturbed by all of it. His assistant put me through to him directly, a small courtesy that I had always appreciated. "Margaret," he said, "it's been a while. How are you?" "I've been better, Howard," I said. "I need to see you as soon as possible. Something has come up that can't wait." There was a brief pause. Howard did not ask unnecessary questions. "Can you come in tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock? "I'll be there," I said. I spent that evening going through files. Robert had been meticulous, bless him, and every document I could possibly need was organized in the fireproof cabinet in the study. Bank statements, property deeds, investment records going back 15 years. I pulled everything relevant and made a neat stack. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I made myself a proper dinner, chicken soup from scratch, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the radio on. I needed to think clearly, and I could not think clearly on an empty stomach or a sleepless night. As I ate, the plan began to take shape. It wasn't a plan born of revenge. Not yet, anyway. It was a plan born of protection. My first instinct was simply to make sure that whatever Daniel and Brittany were scheming, they would find nothing to take. I needed to understand my legal options. I needed to know whether updating my will and restructuring my accounts could create a wall they could not breach. But somewhere between the soup and the silence, a second thought arrived, quiet and precise. Protection alone is not enough. If they are willing to do this once, they will try again. And that thought, small, cold, and perfectly clear, was the seed of everything that followed. I washed my bowl, dried it, and put it away. I set my alarm for 7. I laid out my clothes for the morning, my navy blazer, the one I wore to serious meetings, and I slept. Not well, but enough. Because tomorrow, I was going to see Howard Finch. And the next chapter of this story was going to be written on my terms. Howard Finch's office was on the second floor of a red brick building on Fifth Avenue South, just off the square in downtown Franklin. I had been there twice before. Once when Robert and I updated our wills in 2009, and once when we set up the trust after his diagnosis. Both times, I had been sitting across from Howard as a wife, managing things together with my husband. This time, I sat alone. Howard listened without interruption as I told him everything. I described the message on Daniel's phone precisely, word for word. I had written it down that evening, verbatim, before the exact phrasing could soften in my memory. I told him about the gradual withdrawal, the shorter phone calls, the sense over the past 2 years that my son was being managed away from me. When I finished, Howard removed his glasses, cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his breast pocket, and put them back on. "Margaret," he said, "what you're describing is not uncommon. It has a name in elder law circles: predatory conservatorship. The strategy is typically this: establish a pattern of claimed confusion or incompetence, file a petition with the court, and have a family member appointed as guardian or conservator. Once that's in place, they control the finances." "Can they actually succeed?" I asked. "I am not confused. I manage my own accounts, I drive, I live independently." "That works in your favor," he said. "But you'd be surprised what a determined family member and a cooperative physician can accomplish if the groundwork is laid carefully. The phrase diminished capacity suggests they may already have spoken to someone." He paused. "Have you had any medical appointments recently where you felt the doctor was asking unusual questions?" I thought back. 3 months ago, Daniel had accompanied me to a routine cardiology follow-up, something he had volunteered to do, which had touched me at the time. The cardiologist had asked a standard cognition screening at the end of the appointment. I had answered perfectly, thought nothing of it. Now I thought a great deal of it. "I believe they may have already taken one step," I said. Howard nodded slowly. "All right, here's what we're going to do." The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a clear picture of my options and a list of actions to take in a specific order. Howard would file paperwork to formalize my legal competency status. A preemptive measure, creating a documented record. I would update my will and restructure the beneficiary designations on my investment accounts and life insurance policy. I would also consult a separate physician, one of my own choosing, for a formal, independent cognitive evaluation. "Document everything," Howard told me as I stood to leave. "Every conversation with Daniel, every visit, every irregularity." I drove home with the windows down, even though the April air was still cool. I needed the wind. Over the following days, I noticed something I had expected, but still found remarkable. Daniel began calling more often, not warmly. The calls had a probing quality, a careful cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. He asked how I was feeling. He mentioned, twice, that Brittany was worried about me living alone. He suggested gently that perhaps we should update some of the paperwork on my accounts together to make things easier. I told him I felt wonderful. I told him not to worry. I told him I had just been to the doctor and everything was perfectly fine. The calls stopped after that, replaced by a silence that had an entirely different texture than before. This was not the silence of a busy son. This was the silence of people recalculating. Good, I thought. Let them recalculate. The documentary evidence arrived on a Friday morning, 10 days after my first meeting with Howard. Howard had, through proper legal channels and with my written authorization, requested a review of certain account activity related to a joint account Daniel and I had held for household emergencies. A small account, only a few $1,000s, but one that Daniel had co-signatory access to. The bank records showed 17 withdrawals over the previous 14 months, totaling just over $9,300. None of them had been discussed with me. None of them corresponded to any purpose I could identify. I sat at my kitchen table with the printed statements in front of me and looked at the dates and amounts, small enough to seem administrative, frequent enough to be deliberate. They had already started. I called Howard from the kitchen landline, the old one, mounted on the wall, the one Robert had insisted on keeping even after everyone else switched to cell phones. He had said, "There are times you'll want a phone that doesn't run out of battery, Margaret." He had been right about more things than I could count. "Howard," I said, "they've already been taking money." "I see the records," he said. "This changes things significantly. This is no longer just a preventive matter. This is documented financial exploitation of an elder. Are you prepared to move forward on all fronts?" I looked out the kitchen window at the dogwood tree. The white blooms were fully open now. "Yes," I said, "I'm entirely prepared." The first move was the cleanest. Howard filed the updated estate documents on a Monday morning. A revised will, restructured beneficiary designations, and a formal durable power of attorney naming Claire, not Daniel, as my legal representative in the event I became incapacitated. Claire did not yet know the full story. I had called her the previous week, told her only that I was updating my legal documents and wanted her to serve in that role, and asked her not to mention it to Daniel. Claire, who was sharper than anyone gave her credit for, had asked only one question. "Mom, is everything okay?" "It will be," I had said. The second move was to separate the emergency joint account, closing it, and transferring the remaining balance to a new account in my name only. Howard had also sent a formal letter, on firm letterhead, to Daniel's home address, notifying him that the joint account had been closed and that any further questions regarding my finances should be directed to Howard's office. That letter arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday evening, Brittany was in my driveway. I saw her car from the living room window before she knocked, a white Range Rover, parked at an angle that suggested she had not been particular about staying between the lines. She knocked 3 times, hard, not the soft knock of a visitor. I took a breath, smoothed my cardigan, and opened the door. She was dressed in tennis clothes, which meant she had come directly from wherever she had been when she saw the letter. Her expression was a performance of calm that she had not quite had time to fully prepare. "Margaret," she said, "we need to talk." "Come in," I said. She did not sit down. She stood in my living room, in the room where Daniel had taken his first steps, where Robert and I had spent 30 Christmases. And she spoke in the tone of someone who is accustomed to winning arguments before they have started. "I don't know what Howard Finch has been telling you," she said, "but what you're doing with these account changes is going to create a tax mess, and it's going to hurt the boy's financial future. Daniel and I have been planning—" "What have you been planning, Brittany?" I asked. She paused. Just a flicker. "We've been planning to make sure you're protected." "From what?" Another pause, slightly longer. "From making decisions that could be impulsive, emotional. You've been alone for 6 years, Margaret. We worry." I looked at her steadily. "Do you?" She switched approaches with the fluency of someone who practiced it. Her voice dropped. She became gentle, almost tender. "We love you. Daniel is devastated that you went to an attorney without talking to him. He feels like you don't trust him. Tell Daniel," I said evenly, "that I will be happy to speak with him directly. But my legal and financial decisions are my own. They always have been, and they will remain so." Brittany's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Margaret, you really should think about what you're doing. There are people who will take advantage of a woman in your position." "I'm aware," I said. "I'm taking precautions against exactly that." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. She left without touching the tea I had offered, and not expected her to accept. Daniel came 2 days later. This visit was different. He was not cold or performative. He was distressed, genuinely, in the way I remembered from when he was a boy and knew he had done something wrong. He sat at my kitchen table and told me I was being paranoid. He told me Howard Finch was taking advantage of a grieving widow. He told me that everything he and Brittany had discussed was only for my own good. Daniel, I said quietly, the joint account. 14 months, $9,300. Do you want to tell me where that money went? The color left his face. He said it was for various things, emergencies, expenses related to my household that he had managed on my behalf. He would get me documentation. Howard will be in touch, I said. He'll need that documentation as well. Daniel left without finishing his coffee. I stood at the window and watched him go, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Grief. Not fear, not triumph. Grief. Quiet and old. For the son I thought I had raised, and the man sitting across from me in my kitchen. I gave myself 3 days. I drove up to Natchez Trace Parkway on a Thursday morning and walked one of the long trail sections alone among the old trees and the birdsong, and I let myself cry. Not for long, but enough. I ate dinner at a small restaurant in a town I had never visited. I slept in a bed and breakfast with yellow curtains and the sound of rain on the roof. I called Claire and talked for an hour without mentioning any of this, just catching up, listening to her daughters argue in the background, laughing at nothing important. By Sunday afternoon, I was back in Franklin, rested, clear, ready. The gift arrived on a Tuesday. A beautiful arrangement of white peonies in a tall glass vase, with a card in Brittany's handwriting. Thinking of you. We only want what's best for your family. Daniel and Brittany. I put the flowers on the kitchen counter, where they were genuinely lovely, and I felt precisely nothing about the gesture. This, I recognized, was what the 3 days of rest had given me. Not hardness. I was not a hard woman, and I did not wish to become one. But clarity. The clarity that comes when you have made a decision so fully and firmly that there is no longer any internal argument to be had. The flowers were beautiful. They were also a bribe. Both things were true, and neither one moved me. Brittany called the following morning. She was warm, solicitous, a version of herself I had rarely encountered. She hoped I had received the flowers. She hoped I was feeling well. She said, almost in passing, that Daniel had spoken with a financial advisor, a very good one, in Nashville, and that perhaps we could all sit down together, the 4 of us, and discuss things in a positive, collaborative way. No attorneys, no formality, just family. I appreciate the thought, Brittany, I said, but any discussion about my finances will include Howard. That's not negotiable. A brief silence. Then, smoothly, of course, whatever makes you comfortable. I said I would have Howard's office reach out to schedule something, and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment afterward, the phone in my hand, and I thought about how different this conversation would have been 6 weeks ago, before the forgotten phone, before Howard's office, before the bank statements. 6 weeks ago, I might have been touched by the peonies. I might have felt the old hope that things were getting better. I might have accepted the invitation to a family dinner and let my guard down over a glass of sweet tea, only to find later that something had been slipped in front of me to sign. The thought was not paranoia. The bank records had already taught me who I was dealing with. I called Dorothy. Dorothy Marsh had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met in a church choir, discovered we shared a love of Georgia O'Keeffe and an impatience with slow drivers, and had been having Tuesday lunches ever since. Dorothy was 70, sharp as a tack, and had survived her own unpleasant divorce from a man who had tried to hide assets in 3 different states. She knew how the powerful attempted to make themselves untouchable. We met at the Blue Moon that afternoon. I told her everything, quietly, over chicken salad and sweet tea. Dorothy listened the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, her eyes steady and warm. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You've done everything right," she said. "Howard Finch is the best man for this. The independent cognitive evaluation was brilliant. That takes the weapon right out of their hands." "I keep wondering," I said, "if there's something I missed. Something they still have that I don't know about." "There may be," Dorothy said honestly, "but you've closed the main doors. Now we watch for the windows." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "You are not alone in this, Margaret. Not for 1 minute." I found myself blinking more than necessary and had to look out the diner window for a moment. The square was bright in the afternoon light. That Sunday, I went to speak privately with Pastor Glenn Hayes after service. Glenn had known me and Robert for 20 years. He was not a man who offered empty comfort. He was practical, grounded, the kind of pastor who showed up with tools when your roof leaked and made sure the widows in his congregation had functioning furnaces before winter. I valued his counsel. I did not tell him every detail, but I told him enough: that I was in a legal dispute with family, that I needed to hold steady, that I occasionally felt afraid. He listened, and then he said, "Margaret, what you're describing takes courage. Don't mistake clarity for coldness. What you're doing is right, and being right is sometimes lonely work." I drove home with the windows down again, the warm Tennessee air moving through the car, and I felt not happy, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Supported, accompanied. Less alone than I had felt standing in my kitchen reading those words on a phone that didn't belong to me. The flowers were still on the counter when I came in, still lovely. I put them in the trash that evening. They came on a Saturday afternoon together at a time they had not called ahead to arrange. I was in the garden when I heard the car, the silver Lexus pulling up the drive and the white Range Rover behind it. 2 cars. I noticed that detail, and I noticed what it meant. They had planned this as a coordinated effort. This was not a spontaneous visit. I set down my trowel slowly, brushed the soil from my knees, and allowed myself one quiet moment before I put on the face I intended to wear for the next hour. It was not a mask. It was simply composure, the kind you earn rather than perform. I took off my gardening gloves and walked to the porch to meet them. Brittany was wearing a soft blouse, a deliberately approachable choice. Daniel carried a bakery box, a peach pie, he said, from the shop in Leiper's Fork that I had always liked. Small calibrations. They had prepared. "We wanted to come by," Daniel said, "because we miss you. We've been worried. We haven't handled things well, and we want to make it right." I invited them in. I made coffee. I allowed the performance its opening. We sat in the living room for 20 minutes in a version of normality. Pie was served. The boys were mentioned. Something was said about Tyler's baseball team. Brittany asked about my garden. I answered pleasantly. Daniel talked about a property he was selling in Williamson County. And then Brittany set down her cup and shifted forward slightly, the way people do when they are transitioning from small talk to the real purpose. "Margaret," she said, "we're here because we love you and we're scared for you. Howard Finch is a lovely man, but he's an estate attorney, and estate attorneys have a financial incentive to complicate things. What he's been steering you toward, all this restructuring, the new will, the power of attorney, it creates tax liabilities you may not understand. It isolates you from the people who love you most." She paused. "We're asking you to pause. Just pause. Let us bring in our financial advisor, a neutral party, and review everything together as a family. What you've done isn't irreversible yet. I let the word yet sit in the air between us. And if I don't pause? I asked. Brittany's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Then I think things are going to become very difficult, Margaret, for everyone involved, including you. Legal processes are expensive, they're exhausting, they're public. Do you really want people in this community reading about a dispute between you and your son? There it was, the threat that had been folded inside the pie box all along. I noticed, not for the first time, how skilled Brittany was at making aggression sound like concern. Every sentence she had spoken since walking through my door had been engineered to position me as fragile, impulsive, and in need of management. It was, I realized, the same dynamic that had been building for years, just now stripped of its usual patience and moved into the open. The fact that she felt bold enough to do it in my own living room told me something significant. She had expected today to work. She had expected me to waver. I looked at my son. Daniel was looking at his pie. Daniel, I said quietly, look at me. He looked up. He was 42 years old, and he looked, in that moment, very much like the teenager who had once backed the car into the garage door and spent 3 days trying to find a way not to tell his father. Are you threatening me? I asked. Mom, nobody's threatening. I want to hear it from you, not from Brittany, from you. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. We're just saying that this can get complicated, for all of us. I know it can, I said. I'm prepared for that. I stood up. I was not angry, or rather I was angry, but the anger was controlled, directed, precise. I want you both to understand something clearly. I am in excellent health. I am in full possession of my faculties, a fact that is now formally documented by 2 independent physicians. I have an attorney who has reviewed my accounts, and I have reported the unexplained withdrawals from the joint account to the appropriate authorities. I paused to let that land. The conversation you wanted to have today, the one where I agree to pause and reassess and perhaps sign something in a family meeting with no attorneys present, that conversation is not going to happen. It was never going to happen. The color in Brittany's face was interesting. She had come in practiced and smooth, and now the practice was visibly slipping. You're making a terrible mistake, she said. I don't believe I am. They left. The pie sat on the table, barely touched. I noticed that Daniel had not looked back at me as he walked down the porch steps. Not once. I wasn't sure whether that meant shame or something harder than shame. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps he was simply a man who had made choices he could no longer look his mother in the eye over, and he knew it, and the knowing was its own particular punishment. I locked the door behind them, walked back to the living room, and sat in Robert's chair. And then, for the first time since this had started, I felt fear. Genuine, physical fear, the kind that settles in the chest and makes the room feel smaller. Because they had said public. They had said difficult. They had not been bluffing about their willingness to escalate. But as I sat there, something shifted. The fear was real, and so was what lay underneath it. They are afraid of what I've already done. People don't threaten you for past actions. They threaten you for the ones they believe you're still capable of taking. I reached for my phone and texted Howard. They came today. I'll call Monday with the details. We are on the right track. Then I went back to my garden. There was still an hour of good light left. Howard had asked for 3 weeks to complete the final preparations, and I had given him those 3 weeks without interference. I tended my garden. I had my Tuesday lunches with Dorothy. I went to church. I began, quietly, privately, reading about elder financial abuse cases and what outcomes had looked like for families that had gone the distance. What I read did not comfort me, but it did inform me, and information I had learned was the only armor that actually held. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late May. Howard's office. Both parties with representation. Daniel had hired an attorney, a younger man named Greg Barfield, who worked in a large Nashville firm and had the confident, slightly preemptive manner of someone accustomed to representing people who expected to get what they wanted. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always do. I wore the navy blazer, the same one I had laid out the night before my first meeting with Howard, all those weeks ago. I had pressed it the evening before. Small rituals matter. They remind you of your own seriousness. Howard was already there. Across the table, Daniel and Greg Barfield. Brittany was not listed on the meeting agenda, but she arrived with Daniel, and Greg Barfield made a small effort to seat her that Howard blocked politely but firmly. "This meeting is between the parties specified in the notice," he said. "Mrs. Brittany Calloway is welcome to wait in the reception area." Brittany's face suggested she had not anticipated this. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Greg. Greg gave a small, practiced shrug that said this was a minor point not worth contesting. Brittany sat down in the reception area with the expression of someone filing notes for future grievances. We began. Howard is not a dramatic man. He does not raise his voice. He does not use the kind of language that belongs in courtroom television. He presents facts in a tone of measured, unhurried clarity that I had always found quietly devastating when aimed at the opposing side. He presented the bank records, all 17 withdrawals, dated and itemized. He presented the letter Daniel had not yet provided explaining what the money had been used for, the one Daniel had promised in my kitchen, and which had never arrived. He presented the transcript of the message Brittany had sent to Daniel's phone, the message I had transcribed verbatim the night I read it, and which Howard had attached to a formal affidavit I had signed. He presented the name of the attorney in Nashville that Brittany had referenced in that message. Howard had, through proper channels, confirmed that a preliminary consultation regarding a conservatorship petition had in fact taken place. He presented the documentation of Daniel's accompaniment to my cardiology appointment and the timing of the cognitive screening, and the fact that a copy of that screening had been requested without my knowledge or consent by a third party whose request the practice had, thank God, declined to fulfill. And then Howard presented the independent cognitive evaluations, 2 of them from 2 separate physicians, both concluding in unambiguous clinical language that Margaret Ellen Calloway was in complete possession of her cognitive faculties and showed no indicators whatsoever of diminished capacity. Greg Barfield had been taking notes throughout. At some point, his pen had stopped moving. I watched that happen. The pen simply went still on the pad, mid-sentence, and he did not seem to notice. I thought, that is the moment he understood the position his client is actually in. Daniel was very still. He was looking at the table. "These actions," Howard said with the same unhurried calm, "constitute, at minimum, financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder under Tennessee statute. The unauthorized withdrawals alone meet the threshold for criminal referral. The attempted conservatorship proceedings, preliminary though they were, demonstrate premeditation and intent." There was a long silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that lands differently on different people in the room. On Howard, it was professional and expected. On Greg Barfield, it was the silence of reassessment. On Daniel, it was something else entirely. Greg Barfield began to speak. He used words like context and misunderstanding and family stress. He suggested that emotions had run high and that reasonable people might see the account activity differently, and that his client had always had his mother's best interests. Mr. Barfield, Howard said pleasantly, we are not here to negotiate my client's best interests. We are here to determine what restitution and legal remedies are appropriate. From the reception area, I heard Brittany say something sharp to the administrative assistant. The walls were not especially thick. I wondered what she was thinking, out there in that waiting room chair, cut out of the meeting she had orchestrated. I wondered whether it had yet occurred to her that the entire architecture of the plan she had built, carefully over months and years, had been documented, turned around, and handed back to her as evidence. I looked at Daniel. My son. The baby I had held in a hospital in Franklin 42 years ago, red-faced and furious, and wholly himself. The boy who had slept with a stuffed bear until he was 11 and had cried at Robert's funeral with his face turned away, thinking I couldn't see. Daniel, I said. He looked up. I don't want your destruction, I told him. I never did. But I will not allow this to continue. Something moved across his face. Complicated, old, and too late. Howard handed Greg Barfield the settlement proposal. Greg Barfield requested a 2-week recess to review the settlement proposal with his client. Howard granted 10 days. On the 8th day, Greg Barfield called Howard's office and informed him that his client wished to negotiate. Howard called me that afternoon to relay this information. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang, standing at the counter where the peonies had once sat in their tall glass vase. What would you like to do? Howard asked. I had been thinking about this moment for several weeks. I had imagined different versions of it. A version in which I felt triumphant. A version in which I felt sad. A version in which I made some room for reconciliation. I had sat with all of those possibilities honestly and let myself consider each one. The terms stand, I said. There is nothing to negotiate. The settlement I had authorized Howard to present was not punitive beyond what was necessary. It required full repayment of the $9,300 in documented unauthorized withdrawals, plus interest. A formal signed release in which Daniel acknowledged that no grounds existed for a conservatorship petition and waived any future right to initiate one on the basis of the circumstances previously discussed. Removal of Daniel as primary beneficiary from my life insurance policy, replaced by Claire and a charitable foundation Robert had supported. A formal legal agreement that any future questions about my estate would be directed exclusively through Howard's office. It also included a private letter, not a legal document, not filed anywhere, that I had written to Daniel myself. I had not told Howard about this letter until I handed it to him sealed. It said what needed to be said between a mother and a son, in language that belonged to us and to no court. I had written it at Robert's desk, in the study at 10 o'clock at night, and I had cried while writing it. The first time I had cried through this entire ordeal, and the last. Not from weakness. From the understanding that grief and resolve can exist at the same time, that loving someone and refusing to be destroyed by them are not contradictions. What the letter said is between Daniel and me. The agreement was signed on a Friday morning. Daniel came alone, without Brittany, without Greg Barfield at his elbow. Howard witnessed the signature. I sat across the table and said nothing until it was done. When Daniel stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Mom," he started. "I know," I said. "Go home, Daniel." He went. The legal matter was closed. The estate was secured. My will had been finalized in the form I had chosen. The house and the majority of the investment accounts to be held in trust, with Claire as trustee, and specific provisions for the grandchildren, including Tyler and Mason, that bypass their parents entirely and would not become accessible until both boys reached adulthood. Brittany would never touch a single dollar of what Robert and I had built. The cardiologist's office, the one Daniel had accompanied me to, received a formal letter from Howard informing them that any future requests for my records required my direct, written, witnessed consent. The Nashville attorney who had been consulted about the conservatorship petition received a separate letter. Howard knew how to use letters. 3 weeks after the signing, a detective with the Williamson County Sheriff's Office called to inform me that the financial exploitation report Howard had filed had been reviewed and that the documented withdrawals met the threshold for a formal investigation. I was asked whether I wished to cooperate with a criminal prosecution. I thought about it for 24 hours. I sat on the back porch both evenings and looked at the yard, and I thought about Daniel's face when he had walked out of Howard's office. I thought about Tyler and Mason. I thought about every woman who had sat in a house like mine and had no Howard, no Dorothy, no organized cabinet of records. Women who had signed things they did not understand, or failed to realize what was happening until it was far too late to stop it. Then I called Howard and told him I would cooperate fully. I want to be clear about why. Not because I wanted Daniel in handcuffs, not out of spite, but because what had been done to me was done to a great many women in a great many quiet houses, and most of them never had a Howard Finch or a Dorothy or a Robert's old filing cabinet full of organized records. The only way to protect those women was to ensure that the people who preyed on them understood there were real consequences. The investigation resulted ultimately in a plea agreement. Not prison, but a significant financial penalty, a criminal record, and terms that would follow Daniel Calloway for a very long time. Brittany filed for divorce 4 months later. I learned this from Claire, who had learned it from a mutual acquaintance, and my reaction was the same plain, quiet thought I'd had standing in my kitchen on that April afternoon with someone else's phone in my hands. So this is what it's come to. Some endings announce themselves loudly. Others arrive without ceremony, settling into their proper shape the way furniture settles when a house finds its foundation. My house was still standing. The summer after everything was settled, I took a trip I had been postponing for 15 years. Robert and I had always talked about Ireland. His grandparents had been from County Clare, and there was a churchyard somewhere on the western coast where names in his family were carved into stones that had stood since the 1800s. We had always said next year, and next year had kept arriving and departing without us on a plane. I went alone. 14 days. A rental car with the wheel on the wrong side. Roads barely wider than a footpath winding through green hills that looked exactly like the postcards, and somehow nothing like them. I found the churchyard on the 3rd day of driving, after 2 wrong turns and one very patient farmer who pointed me down a lane I would never have found on my own. I stood in the rain next to stones with the right names on them, and I spoke to Robert in the way you speak to people who aren't there anymore, but are still, in some elemental sense, present. I handled it, I told him. You would have been pleased with Howard. I stayed an extra 3 days. I ate fresh soda bread in a pub where nobody knew my name or my story. I walked along the cliffs of Moher in the wind and felt, for the first time in longer than I could precisely remember, completely and simply free. Not free from grief. Grief does not leave, it only changes shape. But free from the particular exhaustion of being on guard, of watching for the next move, of carrying a weight that had never been mine to carry in the first place. When I came home, Claire was there. She had driven down from Portland with her daughters, Lily, who was 11, and Nora, who was 8, and had stocked my kitchen and was growing what appeared to be a very ambitious herb garden in my backyard beds. I took some liberties, she said, when I stood at the kitchen door looking at the lavender and rosemary. "Don't stop," I said. We stood there together in the late afternoon sun, and Claire put her arm through mine the way she used to when she was small, and I thought, this is what I protected. This right here. That autumn was the best autumn I could remember in years. Claire came 3 times. Lily began calling me every Sunday evening to tell me about her week, with the particular seriousness of an 11-year-old who has decided you are worth her full attention. Nora sent drawings, elaborate, slightly surreal scenes involving animals in human clothing, which I began framing and hanging in the hallway. By November, the hallway looked like the illustrated wall of a very cheerful and slightly eccentric museum, and I loved it completely. Dorothy and I kept our Tuesday lunches and added Thursday evening walks around the park when the weather permitted. Pastor Hayes started a small scripture study group on Wednesday evenings that I attended not entirely for scriptural reasons. It was good company, good conversation, and Glenn made excellent coffee. I rejoined the Franklin Garden Club, from which I had quietly drifted in the difficult years. Several women welcomed me back with the warm, uncomplicated warmth of people who had simply missed your presence and said so plainly. I had forgotten how restorative that kind of simplicity could be, to be among people who wanted nothing from you except your company. I began, tentatively, writing down the story of what had happened. Not for publication, not yet, but because writing has always helped me understand things that are otherwise too large to hold in the mind all at once. The pages accumulated slowly, in longhand, in a notebook I kept in Robert's desk drawer. As for Daniel, I knew through Claire and through the occasional quiet report from Howard what his situation had become. The plea agreement had required him to disclose the criminal record in professional licensing applications. His real estate career contracted significantly. Not collapsed entirely, but reduced to a shadow of what it had been. He had lost the house in Brentwood when the finances unraveled. He was renting an apartment in Murfreesboro. Tyler and Mason were with him half the time, under a custody arrangement Brittany had contested vigorously and lost on several points. The boys were, by all accounts, adjusting. Children are more resilient than adults deserve sometimes. I thought about them often. More than I thought about Daniel, if I am honest, and more than I thought about Brittany. I had written both boys' letters, brief, warm, entirely free of the adult conflict, and had sent birthday gifts and cards at the appropriate times. Whether their father passed any of this along, I couldn't know. But I had made the effort, and would continue to, because they were Robert's grandsons, and they had done nothing wrong, and they deserved at least one person in their lives who held that fact plainly and acted on it. Brittany had moved back to her hometown in Georgia. I did not know the details of her situation and did not seek them out. What I knew was this: the plan she had spent years carefully constructing, the house in Franklin, the investment accounts, the comfortable trajectory of inheriting a widow's assets while the widow was still alive, had come to nothing. Every move she had made had been documented, formally challenged, and ultimately turned against her. The life she had been maneuvering toward did not exist. I wondered occasionally whether she understood yet how much of her own time and energy she had spent building toward something that was never going to be allowed to happen. I hoped, in whatever small way was available to me, that she would eventually find a life that was genuinely her own, one that didn't require taking from anyone else to sustain it. I did not feel satisfaction at any of this in the sharp way I might have expected. What I felt was something closer to relief, and underneath that, a tiredness. the tiredness of someone who has carried a heavy thing for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. On a Sunday evening in November, I sat on Robert's back porch in the cool dark, a glass of wine on the armrest, the lights of the neighborhood coming on one by one in the early dusk. The dogwood was bare now, its branches making their particular winter pattern against the sky. From inside the house, I could hear Nora laughing at something on the television. Claire had stayed an extra 2 days, and the house had the full, warm noise of people in it again. I thought, this house is mine. It will remain mine. And when I am gone, it will go where I chose to send it. That thought, simple, plain, entirely ordinary, felt like the greatest luxury I had ever known. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is more than one, the first and most important is this: knowing your own mind is not vanity. It is armor. I survived what happened to me not because I was exceptional, but because I paid attention, I moved quickly, and I refused to let love be used as a lever against my own judgment. Know where your documents are. Know what you own. Have an attorney you trust before you need one desperately. And if someone you love begins to make you feel confused about your own clarity, pay attention to that feeling. It is telling you something true. To every woman sitting quietly in a house full of memories, wondering if she is overreacting, wondering if she is being unfair, you are probably not overreacting. And fairness begins with being fair to yourself. What would you have done if you had picked up that phone? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Your story may matter more than you think. And if this one found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves out there.